BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Russell Padmore, checking in with World Business Report. In the next half hour, analysis of the latest developments affecting the global economy. Brexit deal, yes or no? Talks are on a knife edge. Brussels says a deal is close, a claim denied by London. Countries in Asia are racing ahead of Europe and the United States to expand the use of renewable energy. And financially troubled Norwegian Air may have run out of runway.
The market wasn't as lucrative as they'd hoped it would be, and they went through a financial restructuring already earlier this year after having previously cut back substantially last year, and now they're back in the last chance saloon.
And 40 years on from the death of John Lennon, we'll hear how the former Beatle is still an influence on the music business today. First, though, the latest news.
I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. Hello. President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is reported to be in hospital after testing positive for the coronavirus. Mr. Giuliani, who's 76, is understood to be receiving treatment in the Georgetown University Medical Facility in Washington. Peter Bowes has this report.
Rudy Giuliani is the latest member of Donald Trump's inner circle to contract the virus. No details of his condition have been made public. The president tweeted that his lawyer had tested positive while working tirelessly to uncover what he again called the most corrupt election in the history of the US. The former mayor of New York City has been exposed to the virus through contact with people known to have been infected as he traveled the country, leading Mr. Trump's legal challenges to the election results.
The deputy commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards has said a satellite-controlled machine gun fired from an unmanned vehicle was used to assassinate the country's top nuclear scientist last month. With more details, here's Claire Runacres.
Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and his wife were being driven in a convoy on a motorway east of Tehran with security guards when he was shot dead. The deputy commander of the Revolutionary Guards told local journalists that he was killed by a machine gun mounted on a pickup truck, which was operated using what he described as artificial intelligence. He said the weapon was fitted with an advanced camera, which was able to zoom in on the face of Mr. Fakhrizadeh, so that his wife, who was just 10 inches away, wasn't hit. Iranian authorities have blamed Israel for the assassination and have insisted that its nuclear activities are entirely peaceful.
Negotiators from Britain and the European Union have given differing interpretations of whether they're getting closer to agreeing a post-Brexit trade deal. European Union officials say they are close to overcoming one of the key obstacles, an agreement on fishing rights, but the British side has denied this. The other remaining hurdles to a comprehensive treaty are fair competition rules, including government subsidies, and how to police the deal. Talks will resume on Monday. Firefighters on a holiday island in Australia say they may soon be unable to prevent a huge bushfire from advancing after they ordered residents in affected towns to leave immediately. The bushfire warning system on Fraser Island has been raised to emergency level. Fire crews say high temperatures and strong winds are making it especially difficult to contain a series of blazes. Shaima Khalil has more.
The Fraser Island fires are among the most serious since the end of last summer. Australia's previous bushfire season was its most intense on record, though not its most deadly. Its all blazes affect every Australian state, sweeping across 24 hectares of land, destroying more than 3,000 homes and killing or displacing nearly 3 billion animals.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. Bobi Wine, the opposition candidate for the Ugandan presidency, has told the BBC he and his supporters were again attacked by the police as he returned to campaign in Luwuka, where he was arrested last month. He described the police action as brutal and said a number of people had been injured. Italy has reported nearly 19,000 new cases of coronavirus over the past 24 hours, bringing the total to 1.71 million. The number of deaths has now risen above 60,000. More details from Joe Lynham.
Italy, which experienced the first major outbreak on the continent in the spring, is having a major resurgence of the epidemic. Despite breaching 60,000 deaths this year, it still remains behind the UK as the European country with the highest number of fatalities. Meanwhile, Bavaria, Germany's wealthiest and largest state, has imposed local curfews and the partial closure of schools amid a nationwide surge in cases to almost 18,000 in a day. As far as infections are concerned, France remains the worst affected European country with 2.2 million confirmed cases, while Belgium has the highest number of deaths per million in Europe.
Venezuelans have been voting to choose new members of the National Assembly, the only official body still controlled by the opposition. President Nicolas Maduro's Socialist Party is certain to regain control of the Assembly as the opposition is boycotting the vote with the support of the United States and the European Union. They accuse the government of President Nicolas Maduro of interfering in the electoral process. Indonesia has lodged a diplomatic protest with Britain after a Papuan separatist leader living in the UK declared an interim government and himself as president. Benny Wenda, who's lived in Britain since 2003, infuriated the Indonesian authorities when he issued the declaration last week. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Russell Padmore. Thanks for joining us. In our programme today, Brexit talks go down to the wire as the UK denies a claim by the EU that a deal is close. A court in Ireland will decide if bankrupt Norwegian Air will be grounded permanently. And 40 years after the death of John Lennon, we'll hear how he still influences the record industry, although the musician wasn't very good at business.
John could write anything, paint anything, speak to anything. He really was a genius. Running a business was something that he was just not good at.
More on the life of John Lennon shortly. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will be keeping their telephones free as they're due to talk on Monday about the progress of negotiations to secure a deal on the UK's future economic relationship with the EU. Late Sunday, both sides seem to have different opinions about whether a deal is close. The EU's team said an agreement over access to fish in British waters is close, but London denied that was the case. Ireland's Taoiseach, or Prime Minister Micheál Martin, says if the talks fail, the absence of a trade deal will be damaging.
My sense is that we are at a very difficult juncture. I think it's important that the resumed talks use every piece of creativity they can, that the participants to try and get a resolution here, because I think a no deal would be very damaging to all concerned, to the United Kingdom, to the Irish economy, and indeed to the economies of member states as well.
Well, three issues stand in the way of a deal: fair competition, the so-called level playing field, a mechanism to solve future disputes, and access for EU fishing trawlers to British waters. And Brussels says a deal on that is close, which is also the view of David Hassenhorn, the chief Brussels correspondent with Politico.
They are closer on fish. Now, we are not surprised there because, as many people said, the fish are actually a red herring in this negotiation, in part because there's a number there that you can meet in the middle. On fish, it's a question of quotas, it's a question of years for how long EU rights will extend. When there's a number involved, you can, in fact, meet in the middle. The real problem is on the other two areas, which is how attached will the UK remain to the regulatory framework of the EU that reassures all of the 27 that, in fact, it will be a fair competitor that it's dealing with. Britain will not then go into a race to the bottom, making things a lot cheaper and easier by cutting regulation. And in that case, it's very hard to see how both can emerge as victors given the red lines that are there.
There could be a new American president waving the big stick at the British saying, look, Joe Biden is concerned about developments in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the prospect of a hard border, all caused by the British reneging on the agreement they originally signed up to, never mind that Good Friday agreement of about 20 years ago. Could that be influential on the British, preventing them going down that track?
Joe Biden is not the first very powerful Democrat in the United States to warn about this. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, has said that if the Good Friday Agreement is undermined, if there's any danger to Ireland's interests, that there will be no trade agreement with the U.S. that will get through her Congress. She's tough and she means what she says. So when she and Joe Biden stand up and say, look, you have to be very careful here. There was a lot of hard work, including, as you know, by some Americans in getting that Good Friday Agreement in place. They don't want anything that can possibly jeopardize it. And they know, again, from just a big picture perspective, right? The United States is a market of 300 million plus, looks across the ocean at the EU of 440 million, at the UK of only 60 million. Trade is a numbers game. It's a game that's played among the biggest, most powerful competitors. And there, the US has to take into account that it's just going to have a whole lot more business going on with the EU 27 than the UK. Now, of course, there is the special relationship. We know that counts for a whole lot, but the warning is clear. Take care of Ireland or there's going to be a problem.
As you move in the corridors of power behind the scenes, you get to talk to various people in Brussels. You get an impression of what those power brokers in the European Union are thinking. I wonder, is the EU ready to pull the plug, simply exasperated with the British stance, or does Brussels actually want to give the UK every chance?
They have been exasperated for quite some time, but I firmly believe EU leaders when they say that they will negotiate up until the last minute. They will not be the ones to say that these talks have failed. Until midnight on December 31, they will insist that they're willing to keep on talking. 3 weeks ago, we started to hear the EU 27 capitals getting very, very nervous that Michel Barnier, as a negotiator, he's, of course, tasked with reaching a deal. And they wanted him to understand very clearly that a bad deal is not acceptable. A bad deal would be worse than no deal at all, and they're ready to accept that. Clément Beaune, the Europe minister in France, has said France would be prepared to veto a deal. You know, it has to be approved by all 27 on the EU side if it believes that the deal is not good enough. A senior EU diplomat told us Friday, on some issues, I think he was referring to level playing field, they are not right up against the red line. They are on the red line. There's just no more room to move.
Analysis from David Hersenhorn from Politico in Brussels. Well, we've heard quite a lot that failure to reach a deal would lead to British consumers paying more for basic goods. And the transport industry is worried about making sure freight is not delayed because truck drivers don't have the right documents to get through either UK or EU customs. Anna Juraska, the founder of Trade and Borders Consultancy, has been telling me about the impact of not reaching a deal.
I guess the best way to think about the difference between a deal and no deal is that a deal addresses a number of issues behind the border, such as alignment in terms of regulation, standards such as harmonization in various areas. So this is what it does. In terms of borders, it doesn't necessarily change what is required from traders when it comes to crossing borders and border formalities. This is why we say that even with a deal, there'll still be friction, there'll still be difficulties at the border, and traders will still need to be ready for border formalities.
It's fairly understood that if there is no deal between London and Brussels, the price of basic goods in the shops for British consumers will go up, whether that's because the UK is having to adopt World Trade Organization rules, which would mean that there would be some sort of tariffs maybe, but ultimately prices of British consumers would go up, and that might convince the politicians they need to reach an agreement.
Yes, if we don't have a deal, there will be tariffs between the UK and the EU, and we do know what these tariffs would be because we do have the WTO tariff of the EU as well as of the UK at this point. So we know what these tariffs would be. Plus, in addition to tariffs, there would also be the question of additional paperwork and additional administrative costs. I think both sides understand the importance of the deal and are aware of the impact of what no deal would mean to consumers and businesses as well.
These negotiations have been fraught for a long time. Both parties, London and Brussels, seem to constantly break deadlines, but we're now in a situation where minds need to be focused. This is apparently the week where everything needs to be decided or nothing.
It's really an unprecedented situation. In reality, we should have had a deal or no deal several weeks back. It very well may be that the negotiations will continue after this week as well. It's really difficult to say at this point. The difficulty is, once the deal is agreed, once the deal is reached, that's not the end of the process. That's just, in a way, a beginning of the process of then implementing the deal on the 1st of January. The key point here is, if the deal is agreed this week, or let's even say next week, will there be any sort of implementation period, any sort of freeze period, any kind of grace period for companies, for everyone else to read the deal, understand the deal? Will there be enough time for all the interested parties to scrutinize the deal, for lawyers to review the agreement and make sure it's consistent with national legislation? The question is, what happens if we do get a deal in the last minute? I still believe there will be a deal. It just will be very last minute. And obviously, there will need to be a way to then implement it on the 1st of January.
A lot of it's about paperwork, isn't it, for people trading between continental Europe and the UK. Whether there is a deal or no deal between the politicians, these business people who send their goods between the UK and Europe and vice versa, they just don't know what to do yet, do they? And that's maybe the real problem.
I think so. So if we have a deal, even if we reach what's called a zero tariff, zero quota deal, that still means that the zero tariff bit is conditional on goods fulfilling certain rules. Now, we've not seen these rules because these rules have not been negotiated yet, or even if they have, we've not seen them. Traders do not necessarily know what these rules are, and they haven't even started preparing for complying with them. And that is just understanding the rule. You still have to provide paperwork to demonstrate that you comply with these rules in order to get that zero tariff. So it will take a while for businesses that are still struggling to understand what customs formalities and what border formalities, to understand what they need to do on top to get that tariff-free treatment if we get a deal.
Anna Jareska from Trade and Borders Consultancy. They're based in London and Geneva. Well, countries around the world are under pressure to combat climate change. It seems though nations in Asia are racing ahead of Europe and North America. China and India are forging ahead with the use of solar panels and wind turbines to generate electricity. One of our regular economic commentators, Michael Hughes, says countries in Asia are more exposed to the impact of climate change, which has an incentive, therefore, to expand the use of renewable energy.
They're quite a far way ahead, really. Remember that Asia is likely to account for 43% of all global energy demand by 2040. But it's also the most exposed to climate risk. So they have an incentive to change their energy supply fairly quickly. And at the moment, they have the largest share of installed renewable capacity globally. They've got something like 45% of their energy from renewable sources.
And I suppose it's worth bearing in mind, China, for example, would be the world's leader now in manufacturing solar panels, harnessing the power of the sun. Wind turbines as well are quite big in countries like India. This goes to show that maybe here in Europe we were thinking we need to go green. A lot of oil companies are changing their strategy as well, but somehow these countries in Asia have leaped ahead significantly, have they?
They have. As I said, something like 45% of their energy supply is coming from renewable sources, obviously solar and wind, and that compares with 25% in Europe and only 16% in North America. And that's largely driven by India and China with their use of solar and wind energy. But South Korea and Japan are going through a different process, and they're very much focusing on hydrogen fuel cells. So between the two areas, you're seeing a complete transformation, really, of their attitude to energy supply.
That fuel cell technology would be largely for the automotive industry, and let's not forget, both Japan and South Korea have significant car industries.
They do, so it's not really surprising that they're going down that particular route. But the speed with which they're doing it and the production of new products and new models that are coming through in the next 2 or 3 years suggests that they clearly are looking to be a market leader within the next 5 to 10 years.
And of course, when we look here to Europe, countries like Norway are talking about getting out of the oil industry entirely somewhere in the medium term. And the big oil giant BP has also been talking about changing its strategy. Do you think developments with renewable energy in Asia have finally persuaded either Norway or these big oil companies that they also need to change?
Well, I think it has, but equally I think there is a political demand within Europe and to some degree now in the States to ensure that we do aim for a carbon neutral target by 2050. And although that sounds a long way away, to make progress on that target, you need to start now.
Independent economist Michael Hughes. Pulsating music in an advertisement for Norwegian Air, a debt-ridden carrier that may soon be grounded permanently. The bankrupt airline's fate will be decided by a court in Dublin on Monday, as most of the company's assets are based in Ireland. The creditors face a stark choice: take a huge loss on what they're owed to allow Norwegian Air to keep flying, or convince the Irish court to wind it up and sell any assets to get something back. Patrick Edmond, the managing director of the aviation consultancy Altair, has been telling me what's gone wrong for the Scandinavian airline.
The bet on low-cost long-haul, even before COVID came along, hadn't really paid off. They'd found that the market wasn't as lucrative as they'd hoped it would be. There was more competition than they expected. And they went through a financial restructuring already earlier this year, after having previously cut back very substantially last year. And now they're back in the last chance saloon for probably the last time.
The government in Norway effectively decided it wouldn't bail out the airline. Was that the final nail in the coffin?
The final nail is perhaps being prepared to be hammered in, but hasn't been fully hammered in yet. Norwegian was providing a lot of international services from Norway, so if the Norwegian government wanted to bail out a carrier, Norwegian would be the one. Two interesting things happened in the last couple of months. A group of Norwegian aviation veterans got together and announced they were starting a new airline to provide a lot of the domestic routes that Norwegian is currently flying on. And also Wizz Air, one of the most aggressively expanding low-cost carriers in Europe, announced it would move into the Norwegian domestic market as well, clearly smelling blood. That darkened the road ahead for Norwegian quite considerably, because now they could no longer claim that they were the only game in town deserving of government support.
So can Norwegian actually survive through the bankruptcy process and somehow get reorganised to start flying again? Or are we going to see a position through the Irish courts that effectively the assets of the airline, most of which seem to be based in Ireland, are going to be sold to pay off the creditors?
To set the scene a little bit, at the beginning of 2020, Norwegian was flying over 150 aircraft. As of a week or two ago, they had a total of 6 aircraft actually flying. Most of those were on domestic services in Norway. The rest, just like other airlines, are parked up. They've already had to retrench almost to a point of total hibernation. The challenge now, as they go into examinership in Ireland, which is the equivalent of Chapter 11 in the US, for example, is they have to demonstrate that there's a reasonable prospect of coming out of it the other end. That means reaching agreements with their lessors and their other creditors, who are essentially facing a very unpalatable choice. Do they accept a very, very significant write-down of their debts, or do they refuse their approval for the examinership and see if they can get anything out of a bankrupt company?
What lessons would you say could be learned from the demise of Norwegian for airlines elsewhere?
It's absolutely a case of the strong surviving, and it's not so much even the business model that determines your chances of success at the moment. It's what you have in the piggy bank, or in the case of many of the big European carriers, what you can persuade your national government to put in your piggy bank for you. We've seen some significant bailouts of some of the big European carriers, but we've also seen some of the well-managed and more, let's say, conservatively run airlines that have been prudent in putting significant cash hoards away, being able to batten down the hatches and survive. But Norwegian is by no means the only airline that's in this kind of situation. For example, in Asia, several parts of the Air Asia empire gone into liquidation, and elsewhere in the world, not just in Europe, we would expect other casualties as well.
Does the prospect of successful vaccines against COVID-19 point to a revival for tourism, for holidays, even business travel? Maybe by next summer, 7 months away in the Northern Hemisphere, things will be very different, do you think?
The logistics of vaccine rollout across the majority of the population are going to be enormously challenging, but I think it's fair to expect that by next summer, there will be a significant upsurge in demand for travel. But the big challenge for the airlines is they have incurred so many losses and they are so indebted at this point that it will be difficult to bounce back in any kind of normal way.
The thoughts of Patrick Edmond, Managing Director of the aviation consultancy Altair. Well, Monday marks 40 years since one of the music industry's great recording artists, John Lennon, died. His murder in 1980 shocked many, especially as he had been a campaigner for peace. Here's how New Yorkers heard the news 40 years ago.
The death of a man who sang and played the guitar overshadows the news. Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed last night.
Witnesses told police Lennon was shot near the door to his apartment building as he and Yoko Ono returned from a recording studio.
Well, Well, John Lennon was, of course, a member of the world's most popular band, the Beatles, which he founded originally in the late 1950s as the Quarrymen. Many regard John Lennon as a musical genius, and as a solo artist, his records certainly sold in the millions. He's still an influence today, as I've been hearing from Jude Sutherland Kessler, author of the John Lennon series, a biography of the musician.
John was such a strong voice all over the world, but especially in America, that politicians were terrified of him. He was being followed by the FBI. His every move was being charted. They were really afraid that John would speak to youth, and he had already spoken to youth, but he was very anti-war.
One of his greatest messages was peace, but I kind of wonder in the generational differences. When John Lennon was shot dead, 2 decades had gone by since the heyday of the Beatles. The swinging 60s was then part of history. So was he still as relevant in the 80s?
Absolutely. In fact, when I lived in Kansas City a few years ago, they had an alternative bar. I was there during the 90s when alternative music was big. And there was a picture of John Lennon above the door when you walked in. And underneath the picture, it said, "The father of alternative music." He was bridging new areas and new landscapes in music. He and Yoko were moving ahead to a new sound, not the sound of the 60s and not the sound of even the 70s that he was living in, but the sound that would become popular in the 90s. He pushed in the 1970s for the rights of women and recorded that very controversial song that he ran by the NAACP before he recorded it to make sure they were okay with the title, and spoke out for women being in bondage and having to paint their face and dance when they should be considered equal partners. He also spoke out for the rights of working people and spoke out for independence for Ireland and spoke out for many issues. He was the first to say that the police in New York City were underpaid and under-outfitted, and he gave several $1,000s to buy flak jackets for the New York police. Always an activist and always pushing for a great cause.
Would you say, though, he was not that good at managing the business side of the entertainment or creative industry?
No. When they formed Apple, they were looking for a diversion. They were looking for something new and exciting to interest themselves. Since they weren't touring any longer, Apple seemed like a great idea. But no, none of the Beatles were very good at the business side of the house. They were creative, they were imaginative, and those two things never really work well with management.
Millionaires and billionaires often invest their money in other businesses, but I kind of suppose the creation of Apple Records and its then eventual demise showed that John Lennon and indeed the Beatles didn't really have the great brains that you need to oversee a company.
I think they had the brains to do anything they wanted to do, but what they didn't have was the business acumen. And of course, they hired people who were much like them. And a lot of the people that worked at Apple were very creative souls and not managerial souls. And although, John could write anything, paint anything, speak to anything, he really was a genius far beyond our comprehension. Running a business was something that he was just not good at.
40 years on from his death, what is your favourite John Lennon song? Would it be a Beatles hit or one of those records John Lennon recorded as a solo artist?
Well, I love the Beatles' early work. I love the Beatles as a garage band. So my favorite early Beatles song is the cover of Baby It's You. That is John's theme song. That's exactly how he felt about his relationship with his mother, Julia, for whom he later writes, "Half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia." So the words to Baby It's You speak to his soul, but my favorite song, if I had to pick one, is a Lennon solo, and that's "I'm Losing You." What a gutsy, bluesy, powerful song. I'm a Lennon fan. I admit it.
Jude Sutherland Kessler, author of the John Lennon series. Actually, one of my favourite Beatles songs, thinking about it, is All My Loving. That's a story for another time. Thanks for your company today. I'm Russell Padmore. Always good to have you with us. That's this World Business Report.
This is the BBC World Service, where Harriet Gilbert is here to tell us about the final author from the BBC World Book Club's year devoted to women writers.
I think I started this book because I didn't know my family history very well.
On this month's World Book Club, I chat with Ya Jassi about her novel, Homegoing.
I was getting myself into something that would really take over my life.
Opening in the 18th century in West Africa, Homegoing begins with two half-sisters who don't know each other. One is sold into slavery. The other becomes a slave trader's wife.
I started to realize that I really wanted people to feel that passage of time. I wanted time itself to feel as though it were a character.
Over the next 200 plus years, we follow the stories of the sisters and their descendants from Africa to America, with each generation bearing the different scars of slavery.
World Book Club at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. How does a Californian community of idealists go from social activism to self-destruction in the Guyanese jungle?
I said, if you see me shot dead, please just get my son out, because I did not expect to survive that day.
Over 900 people died, mostly poisoned by cyanide-laced drink. I'm Erin Martin, and just after the news in Heart and Soul here on the BBC World Service, I'll be finding out how the Reverend Jim Jones led People's Temple from San Francisco to the terrors of Jonestown.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is reported to be in hospital after testing positive for the coronavirus. He's understood to be receiving treatment in the Georgetown University Medical Facility in Washington. The deputy commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards has said a satellite-controlled machine gun fired from an unmanned vehicle was used to assassinate the country's top nuclear scientist last month. Ali Fadavi said the weapon that killed Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was mounted in a Nissan pickup and that there was no human agent present. Negotiators from Britain and the European Union have given differing interpretations of whether they're getting closer to agreeing a post-Brexit trade deal. EU officials say they have almost overcome one of the key obstacles, an agreement on fishing rights, but the British side has denied this. Australian firefighters have warned that they may soon be unable to stop the advance of a major wildfire on a renowned holiday island. The bushfire warning system on Fraser Island, a designated World Heritage Site off the coast of Queensland, has been raised to emergency level. Romania's opposition Social Democrats have taken a narrow lead over the governing National Liberal Party as votes are counted following a parliamentary election. However, it's unlikely that the Social Democrats will take charge, as the Prime Minister Ludovic Orban's party has more potential allies. Thousands of people have joined a funeral ceremony for the former Uruguayan president, Tabaré Vázquez, who died of lung cancer at the age of 80. Mr. Vázquez was a cancer doctor who campaigned tirelessly against the tobacco industry during his 2 terms in power. Indonesia has lodged a diplomatic protest with Britain after a Papuan separatist leader living in the UK declared an interim government and himself as president. BBC News.
The youthful sound of People's Temple, a new religious and political movement which attracted people who wanted to improve the world.
It was an exciting time to be alive. I enjoyed being in the church.
Led by a charismatic preacher who claimed to have supernatural powers, the Reverend Jim Jones.
The only ethic by which we can lift mankind today is some form of socialism.
But in the late 1970s, it all went horribly wrong.
If you wanted to leave, all you saw was, I'm in jail.
On November 18, 1978, over 900 People's Temple members died at Jonestown, their commune deep in the Guyanese jungle.
I said, if you see me shot dead, please just get my son out, because I did not expect to survive that day.
Others perished elsewhere in Guyana. Some took their own lives, whether willingly or not. Others were simply murdered.
Where's the vat with the greens tea in, please? Bring it here so the adults can begin.
Until 9/11, it was the largest deliberate loss of American civilian lives.
Unconfirmed reports reaching Georgetown say there have been mass suicides at the Jonestown settlement.
I'm Erin Martin, and over 2 episodes of Heart and Soul from the BBC World Service, I'll be speaking with some of the survivors, several of whom rarely give interviews. From them, we'll find out just how People's Temple traveled from idealism in California to despair in Jonestown. I have to declare an interest here. The first few years of my life were spent as part of the Church of Bible Understanding, the COBU for short. They were a group of young idealists, so similar to the People's Temple in many ways, including their allegiance to a charismatic and abusive leader. So I've spent a good deal of time looking into what makes these groups tick. The term cult is hanging in the air here, but it's not always a helpful one. So we're going to leave it there as we begin our journey with what attracted folks to People's Temple in the first place. Vietnam veteran Tim Carter certainly didn't set out to join a cult.
As soon as I walked in the door, I was home. Everybody's had an experience where you meet somebody and after 10 minutes, you feel like you've known them all your life. And that's what it was like for me. I hadn't even met Jim Jones yet. Anyway, when I went up to the meeting and heard Jones talk, it was, for me, a synthesis of what I believe politically and spiritually. And when I could see with my own eyes what the temple was doing in San Francisco in terms of helping people, it was for me. A free medical clinic was kept open with our money. A free animal clinic was kept open with our money. A senior citizens program to help them deposit checks when they got their Social Security was kept going with our money. But I felt good that I was in some way making a difference in making the world a better place to live.
And some of the people who were helped joined the church because of it.
My name is Leslie Wagner Wilson. We were introduced to People's Temple in the late 70s by a friend of my mother's.
Leslie's black middle-class family was one of many who were drawn to the temple.
My sister Michelle was involved in drugs, and so my mother was at wit's end. And a friend of hers said there's a church called People's Temple that has an excellent drug rehab program, and that's how we began our journey to People's Temple. For me at 13, I didn't have a choice, but I was easily indoctrinated into the socialist theology, and I felt as if I was going to be a major part in changing the world.
My name is Vera Washington. I joined People's Temple in the early 70s.
Vera spoke to us from outside her house in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the temple had moved in the 1970s, and many People's Temple survivors still live.
Jim Jones came to our family church, and he was talking about civil rights and equality. And I had been part of the civil rights movement as a child when I was born in Alabama.
And you had some happy memories there. I mean, and this is true of my family too. What were some of your initial happy memories?
Well, he was very kind and open to the youth and young people. We did adventurous things that we didn't do growing up in San Francisco. We went on hikes and had big picnics, and it was an exciting time to be alive.
And were you in the choir too?
I was, yes.
What was that like?
Oh, a lot of fun.
If we give them all, it will set us free, and we'll feel the joy that life.
Leslie Wagner Wilson was also in the choir, who recorded this album in 1973.
It was amazing to be in a studio and singing, and this album was so incredible. I felt proud and honored to be on this recording. These are people that had a mission to really try to change the world, and that's what we were singing about.
He gave us all for us that day.
So Leslie, out of the group of you who worked on He's Able in the choir, how many ultimately survived?
I think I can count 4, including myself, that I know of, that survived. So these are voices from beyond the grave.
So let us give them love and set them free.
Jordan Vilches was in the choir too. She followed her older sister into People's Temple in 1970.
I felt like I belonged to something like a big family. I had never been in a choir before, and I used my voice to blend in with other people, and that was fun. It was really fun.
What struck me is the sense of belonging.
This is Stephen Jones, Jim Jones' son, who we spoke to alongside Jordan.
Jordan said it beautifully, using her voice to join other voices and have yourself become part of a greater whole. And for me, it not only happened through the music, but it happened visually, because in the temple, it was every color in the rainbow, every human hue And usually we were dressed in every color imaginable. And choir, obviously, they're all in blue, bless their hearts. But it was just a real hodgepodge of people. And this was even when I was an adolescent and I was hating my father. And I could be seething and come upon a temple service. And when I saw that, that would just melt away. And I didn't know what I was feeling at the time. I know it now, but it was just this tremendous, deep sense of belonging.
You ever needed your God before?
I'm Mike Cartmel. I was in the People's Temple from 1959 to 1977.
So Mike was part of the temple in Indianapolis before its move to California. He's speaking now in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, which is a couple of kilometers from the location of the temple's San Francisco headquarters. He says his mother liked Jim Jones' attention to Jesus as a savior and a teacher, as well as his particular style of faith healing.
Jim brought to it an extra dimension, and that would be the dimension of paranormal insights, if you will. And he was very good at it, and my mother was hooked the first time she went. And in those days, Jim was really a traditional Christian minister with an integrationist message, if you will. So I was introduced to him, and I was only 11 years old, and I told him I wanted to be a pilot, a pilot in the U.S. Navy. And he said, well, that's great. We can use more Christian pilots.
We're going to live together, or we're going to die together. And being that I made you somewhat uncertain about your heaven, you better get about doing what Jesus told you to do, build a heaven here. He said, thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth. He said, the word is nigh you. The kingdom of heaven is within you. Here's where heaven's going to have to be made. We'll make a heaven out of this place, or it'll be a hell. And if we don't make a heaven...
And those high ideals really take us to the first of our warning signs along the People's Temple journey. A belief in the work of the temple made members overlook things they were uncomfortable about or felt were morally questionable. And this was endorsed from the pulpit. In the early 1960s, Jim Jones took his wife and family on a missionary trip down to Brazil. Fielding McGee picks up the story. Fielding is research director at Alternative Considerations of Jonestown and People's Temple, a website packed full of temple-related articles, information, and audio, sponsored by San Diego University.
The problem with Jim Jones's stories is that just because he tells them doesn't mean that they're true. But I think it's probably true that sometime when he was down in Brazil, he slept with another woman, and for his services, he got a bunch of money. But he said the reason that he did this was to get money so that he could pay for the services that People's Temple represented. He was willing to take her money to do the people's work.
One of the reasons you're in a cult experience is because you accept what I call the big lie. And the big lie is simply this: the ends justify the means.
This is Mike Cartmel again, who ended up marrying one of Jim Jones' daughters and was at one time named as potential successor to Jim.
Nobody's walking down Geary Boulevard looking at People's Temple and saying, oh, I'm going to go in there and drink some cyanide and bring it into it all. No. Everybody who joins is sort of trapped by their commitment to these incredible social goals. Whether it was ending the war in Vietnam back in the 60s or promoting civil rights, you wanted to be in an organization that was effective, not just a bunch of talkers, and we were very effective. So you join, and you find yourself making these very small moral changes and lifestyle changes.
Yeah.
You join, and then 3 months later, you're told, shouldn't you really move to Redwood Valley and participate in a commune? Then after they say, if you're going to work really for the cause, your children need to be in other places. And by the way, if you're working for the cause, we really want to report treason. And what is treason? Treason is anything that does not express great happiness about being in the church and great wonderment at Jim's wonderful abilities. So you make those decisions one at a time. Imagine, if you will, a set of stairs, and instead of the usual 7-inch high risers, there may be 2 inches. So you barely know that you're going downstairs. But after you've gone down 20, 30 feet, you look back up and you realize, my God, I've made one hell of a decline in a dark hole that I never had any intention of descending. And what do I do now? And that's the problem. What do you do now? First of all, you can't talk to anybody because they'll turn you in and you'll be disciplined severely and humiliatingly. And your personal wealth has been taken by the church. That's how you get trapped. It's like you're going down the rabbit hole an inch at a time.
The next warning sign on our journey with the People's Temple for the BBC World Service is simply this: deceit. Not everything in the temple was what it appeared to be. The same was true of the religious group I was in, the Kobu. No one ever knew the whole truth about anything. Mike was on a trip with a large group of temple members to a meeting in Los Angeles when he stopped at a rest stop and was called in to see Jim Jones.
He said, well, I'm going to do some healings through you. I said, what? I don't have any psychic power, you know that. He just laughed at that and said, don't worry about that. Go talk to Carolyn, and that would have been Carolyn Layton, who was his chief paramour and sort of the chief administrative officer of the church. So, I find Carolyn, and she gave me three 3x5 cards, and each of them had a great many personal details about the individual whose name was at the top of the card. I mean, what kind of medicines they were taking, how many shoes they had in their closet, things like that.
Right.
Carolyn said, Mike, you've got to memorize this. Jim will call you, and then just follow Jim's lead. And, of course, this is all on the hush-hush. So we get to the meeting, and sure enough, he calls me up, and he says, Michael, my son, clear your mind. Look, I'd done enough acting to know how to play a scene.
Yeah.
Sure, he does a flourish with his hands, and says, now, who comes to mind? So I called out one name. The only name I remember is Exie Ellaby. All of a sudden, you get this whoop from the audience, and this lady stands up. He does another flourish with his hands. It was really good theater, I got to tell you. It's a shame we didn't sell tickets, right? But
yeah, right.
So then he says, Michael, I want you to ask actually a few questions that come to mind. So I basically went through the list of things I'd remembered, and she said, oh yeah, I got that, and I got those shoes. And then I think we pronounced Exie Ellaby cured of some form of incurable cancer of which she was completely unaware. Of course, it's easy to cure people of undiagnosed diseases, isn't it? I mean, we could do that over we could do it over the microphone right here.
Exactly.
But I got to say, the response was unreal.
You've got a new heart, child, so just rejoice. Praise God.
I was so astonished by it all that I almost believed it was real.
I told her to him where she come from, where her children was. I saved a son by the name of Roosevelt. He was going to be in an accident. 2 of his children would have been killed. I've already saved him. I did it by transmission. The radio station. You don't know who the radio station is. You ought to, because you just saw I am the radio station.
Of course, faith healings were part of what went on in plenty of churches, but in other ways, People's Temple had moved away from anything that looked like conventional Christianity. The temple was nominally affiliated to the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, an American Protestant denomination. But there was next to no oversight, and the temple was free to chart its own unconventional course. So this is our next warning sign on the way to the terrible end in the Jonestown commune. People's Temple researcher Fielding McGee again.
It was when he went down to Brazil, when he saw really what poverty looked like, and came back to the United States. He was very much alienated from a deity that was going to help people in the world because he just didn't see it. In other words, for a while he was saying things like, this church is doing God's work. And then later he said, God isn't doing it, we are. So it eventually, over the years, became more and more personal to the people in People's Temple, and then more and more so to Jim Jones himself, because after all, who was providing the leadership of this organization?
Has he given you help? Does he go into the court and the jails and set you free? Does his guy, Jesus, do you any good? No! I'm the only one that'll help you. I'm the only one that cares about you. I'm the only one that loves you.
Would you say that this was the time when he started inserting himself as a godlike figure or even referring to himself as God?
It was a very, very, very slow transition. In the mid-50s, when People's Temple established itself, it was very much of a holiness type of church. And then they moved to California, and it became more service-oriented, and then went to San Francisco and became more politically oriented. And when they moved to Guyana, it was much more of a utopian experiment, living communally and practicing communism with the lowercase c. And there were people who went along for that entire ride, right?
Yeah.
All the way through these various transitions. And how did they reconcile that to themselves? I mean, I think what it really testifies to is as things change bit by bit by bit, you don't even notice that you've changed.
When somebody does good, it has to be God. And I'm doing more good than anybody on earth today.
I noticed a definite transition in his sermons and in his private comments.
Mike Cartmel again.
He became increasingly disenchanted with teachings based upon the Bible, and he began to make it very clear that he thought the Bible was, what did he call it, the paper idol, and that Christ's life really wasn't captured with any kind of fairness in the Bible, that they just missed a lot. And you might say, well, how would he know that? Well, because of his extrasensory perception.
The first page of the Bible, you see it's full of hot air. Just read one page and you see it's full of a lie. Why won't you come to me when I have never lied to you? I've given you nothing but truth. I've given you nothing but health. I've given you nothing but homes, happiness, jobs.
There was some Bible study in the 1970s version of People's Temple, but it's not what you think. Here's Leslie Wagner Wilson again, former Temple member and author of a book on her experiences.
We were traveling to Seattle. I was on the advance crew going to cities early on and tried to talk about People's Temple and Jim Jones to have people come to a meeting. And so Seattle was very religious at that time, and we learned scripture only so we can quote scripture when talking with someone who was a believer. We had no Sunday Bible study, no prayer meetings. None of that existed in People's Temple.
We're returning to Vera Washington now to introduce us to our next warning sign, reflecting the pressure she faced from the Temple's leadership when she was a member. It's left her with a strong sense of the importance of independence.
Never give anybody control of everything. Don't let anybody else pay your bills, buy your food, provide you housing. Do it for yourself. I don't care how they explain to you that it's the best thing that's ever happened to you. It's not.
She emptied a whole cookie jar in one night.
What did you say, Judy?
It's in a weekend.
Forgive the quality on this recording, including the jazz they seem to have taped it over, but it's the perfect illustration that life in People's Temple and becoming a so-called good socialist meant giving up a huge amount of your personal freedom. And those who were found to have been disloyal to the cause, even in very small ways, were liable to be publicly humiliated in the weekly catharsis meeting. Kind of like a grim version of a tabloid talk show.
Well, did you empty a whole cookie jar? Oh, laughing, so they laugh.
Then they started paddling people. And I mean not just a simple pat, but I mean paddling people. There were beatings, actually.
Someone hold him. Someone hold the child so there won't be any mix-up that they get hit right. I want him hitting the bottom. No place. Give it to him. Not getting there. It's not quite enough, brother, but in the future, go on.
By the time we got to San Francisco, the punishment became more severe, and including boxing matches, and that was putting someone who obviously was a weaker opponent against a stronger opponent, and of course the weaker opponent was the one that was in trouble. And they would actually have boxing matches that drew blood. And Jim would just giggle in this sinister laugh. That's what they deserved. But we all played into that because no one said anything.
And if the catharsis meetings and other strains of temple life became too much, and you actually decided it was time to get out, how easy was it? One technique Jim Jones used and continued to use right up until the last day in Jonestown was to make life beyond People's Temple seem like a hugely scary place. Here's Jordan Vilches again.
It was talked about constantly that the outside world was going to become a fascist state, and city blocks were structured in a certain way with the intention of rounding people up and detaining people. And so for us, and particularly for kids growing up, the outside world was seen as empty and meaningless and dangerous.
There's also the idea of confirmation bias to factor in here. Confirmation bias is basically wanting to think that the money or effort you've spent on something is well spent, even though you might actually be suffering a significant loss. I can relate to this. It took years for my family and many of our friends to come to grips with the time we wasted in the Kobu. Stephen Jones thinks that was another major factor in stopping people leaving the temple.
I saw people give everything. Their nearly every waking hour, which stretched to the point where people were up 20 hours a day, sometimes around the clock. They gave all their money to the temple and lived communally.
So if there's anyone here tonight that can make a sacrifice in a large sum of money, do it now. Know how to get a hold of some large money. Anybody here that'll give $1,000 tonight?
They invested everything. They left behind their families in some cases. They were all in, and they did that for a long period of time. And so when the time came that it became, I think, clearly evident that this is not what I thought it was, they had invested so much into that. And rather than see all that time and energy and love and money that you put into it as a waste, better to rationalize what you're seeing right now, better to justify it, better to turn a blind eye to it.
Former member Leslie Wagner Wilson tells us about another factor that made it hard to leave. Blackmail of a very particular kind.
In San Francisco, at a meeting, Jim said, we're passing out blank pieces of paper. This is your declaration that you are committed and you are trustworthy. So you sign this blank piece of paper, and he's telling us we can fill it in, complete it, saying that you're a pedophile, a rapist, a murderer. But this is proof that you are all in. And most people signed. I did, and I was probably 18 years old. I signed this piece of paper, this blank piece of paper.
And the dangers of sharing doubts meant that things which would normally have driven people away from the temple were ignored, because individuals would tend to think it was just them who had concerns. Tim Carter says he ignored a series of what he calls yellow flags, including a dramatic night in 1976.
So on this night, a woman named Maria comes into the Planning Commission meeting where it's just on stage, 100 people in chairs, and she's got a bunch of styrofoam cups of wine. So she said, everybody want wine? I hadn't had any wine since I had been there, so heck yes. So we drink the wine, and then the meeting starts. At about 10 minutes after everybody's finished with their styrofoam cup of wine, Jones says, you've all just been poisoned. You have an hour to live. So I immediately went into like combat mode, you know, the adrenaline rushes and everything else. Anyway, after about an hour, he said, well, you haven't been poisoned. You know, it's like, okay, I thought so. Now, this whole thing I just described has been called a suicide rehearsal. And I take great umbrage at that because I sure as hell was not rehearsing my suicide. So did that feel wrong? Yes, but I rationalized that he wants people to face their own fear of death. Now, 40 years later, would the appropriate response have been, this is a crazy SOB and you need to get out of Dodge right now?
Sadly for Tim, he stayed put. And it was only 2 years later that Tim's family were given poisoned drink. This time, it was for real.
When I got up to the pavilion is when people had started dying. And the only person that I saw being given poison was my son.
We'll hear about that next time in the series For Heart and Soul from the BBC World Service, as we continue our journey from socialism to slaughter. I'm Erin Martin. The producer is Paul Arnold, and the series is a CTVC production.